August 12, 1944. Lorient, Brittany, France. General Wilhelm Fahrmbacher has just received the last coherent operational order from Army Group B. The last order that contains specific operational content, rather than the exhortatory language of an institution that is losing control of the situation it is nominally directing. And he already knows he will not receive another one that matters. The American advance has cut the land routes from the Lorient Peninsula to the rest of German-held France, with the speed that the Third Army's operational tempo has been producing since August 1, when Patton's forces poured through the Avranches Gap and fanned out across Brittany in the exploitation that the Allied planners had been projecting since D-Day, the exploitation whose operational reality in the first 2 weeks of August 1944 has been exceeding the planners' most optimistic projections in pace and in depth, and in the specific and catastrophic effect on German command coherence that the speed of the American advance is producing across Brittany. The 6th Armored Division has sealed the landward approaches to Lorient in the rapid advance across Brittany, the port city of 60,000 civilians whose lives are about to become entangled with the military operation in ways that neither the German garrison nor the American encirclement force has fully planned for, and a German garrison of approximately 25,000 soldiers is encircled. The U-boat base at Lorient, the most important Atlantic submarine facility in the German Navy's Western operations, the base whose concrete pens have been sheltering and servicing the Kriegsmarine's U-boats since 1941, and whose bombing the 8th Air Force and the RAF have been attempting without success since the pen's construction made aerial bombardment ineffective, is now cut off from the Reich. Fahrmbacher has his orders. The Führer has designated Lorient a Festung, a fortress to be held to the last man and the last round. The designation whose political and military meaning in the German command system of August 1944 is the declaration that the position's holding overrides any operational calculation that would otherwise produce the professional decision to withdraw, and whose practical effect is to remove from Fahrmbacher the professional option of making the rational military decision that the map and the intelligence and the operational situation are producing in his professional assessment. The strategic rationale is increasingly unclear, and Fahrmbacher, a Bavarian artillery officer who has been in the German army since 1907 and who has commanded at every level from battery to corps, is beginning the professional assessment that will occupy him for the next 9 months. What does holding Lorient actually accomplish for a garrison that cannot be relieved, in a war whose strategic direction has already moved past the point where the Lorient pocket's holding changes anything, in a port whose U-boat facilities will not be used again by a submarine fleet that is losing the Battle of the Atlantic? The answer, in Fahrmbacher's professional calculation, is this. Holding Lorient ties down Allied forces, specifically the American forces who must garrison the perimeter to prevent a breakout, who must maintain the wire and the listening posts and the patrol schedule and the logistics of the perimeter force that a 25,000-man garrison requires for its containment, and thereby removes those forces from the main advance toward Germany. Every American soldier assigned to watch the Lorient pocket is a soldier not advancing on Berlin, not crossing the Rhine, not reducing the Wehrmacht formations whose destruction is the necessary precondition for the war's end. The calculation is sound in principle, is, in fact, the standard professional military calculation that the Festung concept is built on. The calculation that says a garrison that ties down the enemy serves a purpose even when the garrison cannot win the battle it is fighting. Its operational value declines with every week that the war's broader strategic situation deteriorates. And Fahrmbacher knows this too. He knows that the 94th Infantry Division's containment of the Lorient pocket is consuming a division that the Allied advance could otherwise use. And he knows that as the Allied armies grow in France, and as the German forces facing them diminish, the marginal cost of containing Lorient becomes a smaller and smaller fraction of the Allied strategic resource, whose total is growing. What he is doing at Lorient is not the execution of a strategic plan whose operational logic he endorses and whose success he projects as achievable. It is the professional performance of a military mission in the absence of the strategic context, that would ordinarily determine whether the mission is worth its cost. The performance of a soldier. Who has his orders and who will execute them until the orders change or until the situation makes execution impossible. In the specific and professional discipline of the German officers' training that has been building this capacity for obedient professional execution since the Prussian military's systematic cultivation of it in the 19th century. He holds because he is a soldier, because he has his orders, and because stopping would require a decision of a different kind than the decision to continue, the decision to surrender on his own authority, without the chain of command's authorization, in the specific and professionally dangerous act of a German officer who has decided that his professional judgment overrides the order in his possession. It is a decision that General Hermann Ramke at Brest has already made in the same direction, the direction of holding, not the direction of unauthorized surrender, and that Fahrmbacher will sustain at Lorient through 2 winters, 4 Allied commanders on the perimeter, intermittent radio contact with Berlin, and the specific and accumulating evidence that the war whose outcome the Lorient garrison is supposedly affecting has already been determined by forces and events that the garrison can observe but cannot influence. General Wilhelm Fahrmbacher was born in 1888 in Zweibrücken in Bavaria, commissioned in the Royal Bavarian Army in 1907, and fought in the First World War as an artillery officer in the specific and demanding conditions of the Western Front's artillery war, whose lessons in the relationship between firepower and operational outcome shaped the professional formation of his entire generation of German officers. He served in the interwar Reichswehr, surviving the reduction of the German army to the 100,000 men that the Versailles Treaty permitted, and built his operational expertise through the Wehrmacht's expansion and the campaigns that followed. He is 56 years old when the Lorient encirclement closes, old enough to have professional memories of a Germany that preceded the Nazi state and a German army that existed before the ideology appropriated it. He is not a political general, not one of the Nazi Party's creatures whose military appointment reflects ideological reliability rather than professional merit, not the kind of officer who has built his career on the connection between political loyalty and military preferment. He is a professional soldier of the German army's pre-Nazi tradition, whose career has been built on the artillery officer's specific combination of technical precision and operational calculation. He has commanded the Exovix Corps in France since 1942, building the coastal defenses of the Brittany Peninsula, with the specific and patient professionalism of an officer who has been given a mission, prepare the Atlantic Wall in this sector, and who executes it with the available resources and the time that the strategic situation provides. He knows Brittany in the specific and professional way of a commander who has spent 2 years building its coastal defenses, who has walked its terrain in the inspection visits, whose frequency reflects his understanding that the defense he is building must be grounded in the specific geography of this specific place, rather than in the generic principles of defensive construction that the manuals provide. He knows the Lorient garrison's composition and its capabilities, knows which formations are reliable under the specific and prolonged pressures of siege conditions, which are marginal, which are the professional corps that will maintain their military function through the siege's demands, and which will require the most intensive management to keep at their posts when the siege's conditions produce the demoralization that the indefinite wait generates. And he knows, with the professional honesty of a commander who has been reading the operational situation accurately since the Allied landing in June, that the Festung designation of Lorient is the strategic expression of a hope rather than a plan. The American force assigned to contain Lorient does not stay constant through the 9-month siege, reflecting the American command's changing assessment of the containment mission's required resources as the siege's character becomes established, and as the broader operational priorities of the campaign toward Germany pull formations away from the static containment mission that Brittany represents. In August 1944, it is elements of Major General Robert Grove's 6th Armored Division that close the perimeter in the rapid advance across Brittany, whose operational momentum is the product of the Avranches breakout. By September, as the American operational priority shifts decisively to the advance toward Germany and the Siegfried Line, whose approach requires the maximum available combat power. The containment mission passes to the 94th Infantry Division under Major General Harry Maloney, a formation that will spend most of its European campaign not advancing but watching, maintaining the perimeter that prevents a breakout by a garrison that Fahrmbacher has never intended to break out, and that could not break out successfully if it tried. 25,000 men against the available Allied forces in Brittany is not an equation that produces a successful breakout. In the specific and sometimes demoralizing operational situation of soldiers assigned to a static mission when the war's decisive action is happening elsewhere, the strategic calculation is almost perfectly balanced in its futility. Fahrmbacher holds a position he knows he cannot hold indefinitely, whose holding serves a purpose whose value is declining, but whose abandonment requires an authorization that Berlin is not providing. Maloney contains a pocket whose garrison is not attempting to break out, and both men are performing their professional military missions with the specific and professional discipline of officers who understand that the mission assigned is the mission executed until a different order arrives. The different order will arrive, for both of them, on May 8, 1945. German surrender. End of mission. 9 months. 2 winters. 1 operational stalemate whose participants understood from the beginning how it would end, and who maintained it with the professional discipline of soldiers who do not quit their posts simply because they can see the endpoint from where they are standing. The question that the 9-month siege of Lorient poses, and that neither the German historians who have studied Fahrmbacher's decision in the Foreign Military Studies records, and the German Army's post-war operational assessments, nor the American historians who have analyzed the containment operation's costs and its strategic returns, have fully resolved to their satisfaction, is whether Fahrmbacher's holding of Lorient served any purpose commensurate with its cost. Commensurate with the 9 months of the 94th Infantry Division's service on the perimeter, commensurate with the 25,000 German soldiers whose military service for those 9 months consisted of being in a pocket that the broader war was passing by, commensurate with the 60,000 French civilians whose lives were circumscribed by the military occupation and the siege's deprivations for 9 months of a liberation they could see approaching but could not yet reach. August 1944. The Lorient pocket settles into the specific and grinding operational pattern that 9 months of static siege will establish as its characteristic form. The form of a military operation that is not advancing, not retreating, not engaging in the kind of combat that the war's operational history has established as military activity's primary expression, but simply existing, day after day, week after week, in the specific and institutional endurance that a professional military garrison can sustain when its commander has the professional competence to manage it. Fahrmbacher organizes his 25,000 soldiers, a force that includes the Wehrmacht's infantry garrison troops, the Kriegsmarine's naval base personnel, whose primary expertise is maritime rather than infantry, the Luftwaffe's ground personnel, whose combat training has been for the defense of air bases rather than the perimeter defense of a port city, and the miscellaneous garrison elements of a formation that reflects the improvised character of a Festung garrison assembled from the troops available rather than the troops designed for the mission, into the defensive perimeter that the terrain provides. He rations food from the first week, with the specific and professional understanding of a commander who has been in enough difficult operational situations to know that the first week's ration decisions establish the precedent whose discipline the entire siege will either benefit from or suffer under. He establishes the rotation of the defensive positions whose manning requires the continuous presence of soldiers in prepared positions that the American perimeter forces are not attacking vigorously, not because the American command lacks the capability to attack them vigorously, but because the American command has correctly assessed that a vigorously attacked German garrison will absorb the attack from prepared positions, and that the American casualties produced by the attack will not be offset by the operational gains that the containment mission does not require. He maintains radio contact with Berlin through the communications equipment, whose frequency and whose encryption have been providing him with the orders whose operational content has been declining in specificity and increasing in exhortation since August 12, in the specific and documented way of a command structure that has less and less operationally useful information to transmit and more political urgency to communicate. Hold. Resist. The Führer has faith in the garrison's determination. Hold. He holds. This is, in the specific and professional sense that the military's institutional culture has been building towards since Sparta, all that is required of him. Hold. September 15th, 1944. The 94th Infantry Division has taken over the perimeter containment from the 6th Armored, and the Lorient pocket has settled into the specific and almost peaceful routine of a siege in which neither side is currently attacking the other. A routine whose specific and strange normality is unlike anything that either the American soldiers on the outer ring or the German soldiers on the inner ring have been trained to expect military service to produce. The German garrison occupies its prepared positions on the perimeter, positions that the garrison's engineers have been improving since August, in the professional way of a military force that understands it will be in these positions for an indefinite period. The American division occupies its own positions on the outer ring. Between the two lines, the no-man's land of the Lorient pocket's boundary produces the specific and strange landscape of a front line in a siege where the front line is not moving. The wire, the minefields, the listening posts, the occasional patrol whose contact with the opposing patrol produces the firefight that briefly disrupts the pocket's characteristic quietude before the pattern re-establishes itself. The 94th Infantry Division, whose soldiers were expecting to participate in the advance toward Germany, and who are instead watching a German garrison that is not moving, watching from prepared positions on the outer ring of the Lorient pocket, while the 1st Army and the 3rd Army and the 7th Army are fighting their way across France toward the German border, develops the specific and documented resentment of a unit that is being used for a mission whose strategic value they cannot fully see from the position they are occupying, and whose invisibility in the campaign's operational record is the source of the institutional grievance that the 94th Infantry Division's veterans will carry for decades after the war. The near failure in Fahrmbacher's 9-month management of the Lorient pocket, the moment when the garrison's cohesion and the command's authority comes closest to collapsing under the accumulated weight of the hunger and the cold and the purposelessness that the Breton winter is producing in soldiers who have been inside a static perimeter since August, arrives in the winter of 1944-45, when the combination of physical privation and psychological demoralization reaches the threshold at which military discipline's institutional authority is the only thing maintaining the garrison's organizational coherence. The food supply, rationed since August in the systematic and professionally managed way of a garrison commander who understood in August that the siege's duration would be long and that the food supply management from the first day was the logistical foundation of everything else, has been consumed at rates that the garrison's physical activity in the Breton winter's cold and the winter's caloric demands have been accelerating beyond the ration schedule's projections. The garrison is hungry in the specific and militarily significant way that soldiers who are cold and inactive and without sufficient food become organizationally unreliable, and Fahrmbacher is managing the specific challenge of maintaining military discipline and operational readiness in a formation whose morale is being consumed by the same slow attrition that is consuming its food supply. The garrison troops who are not the Wehrmacht's elite, the older Landwehr reserve units whose soldiers have families and farms and civilian lives that the siege is keeping them from, the Luftwaffe ground personnel whose professional identity is in the aircraft maintenance and the airfield operations that this garrison has no outlet for, the naval garrison troops whose training is for ships and for the submarine base's operational support rather than for the infantry fighting that a perimeter defense requires, are less reliably committed to the mission's continuation than the professional soldiers whose institutional culture provides the motivational framework that keeps them at their posts when the cold and the hunger and the purposelessness of the siege would otherwise produce the kind of demoralization that becomes desertion and then collapse. Fahrmbacher manages this with the specific and institutional tools of a German general whose professional formation in the Kaiser's army and the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht has produced the specific competencies of organizational management under adverse conditions, the enforcement of military discipline in the specific and consistent way of a commander whose authority is maintained by the consistent application of the standards that the military structure provides, the maintenance of the daily military routine, whose regular structure, the roll calls, the work assignments, the training exercises that are maintained even when there is nothing specific to train for, provides the organizational coherence that purposelessness would otherwise dissolve, and the carefully managed communications with Berlin, whose content he filters for his garrison, so that the orders to hold are transmitted, and the broader strategic situation that makes the orders increasingly hollow is not. December 1944. Berlin's communication with the Lorient pocket is intermittent in the specific and documented way that the operational records of the siege describe as the growing challenge of a command relationship whose physical basis, the radio link that connects the isolated garrison to the headquarters that are supposed to be directing it, is being degraded by the Allied air interdiction of the radio relay infrastructure and by the growing distance between the stable positions of the German command structure and the communications requirements of a pocket that is increasingly cut off from everything. The communications equipment's range and the quality of the transmissions are declining, with the accumulated maintenance demands that the siege's conditions are producing in equipment that was not designed for 9 months of continuous field use. The orders that arrive when the link is open are the same orders that have been arriving since August. Hold, resist. The Führer has confidence in the garrison's determination, and the operational information that would allow Fahrmbacher to calibrate his garrison's performance against the broader war's progress is increasingly incomplete, increasingly fragmentary, increasingly the communication of a command structure that is itself losing the coherent operational picture that it would need to provide useful direction. He is reading the war from the BBC broadcasts that the garrison's radio operators are monitoring in the specific and professionally risky practice of accessing the enemy's information service, a practice that is technically prohibited, but that the officers allow because the alternative is operating on the basis of information that is less accurate, whose signals the garrison's equipment can receive, and whose accuracy, in Fahrmbacher's professional assessment, is more reliable than the German military's own communications about the strategic situation, from the prisoner intelligence that the perimeter patrols occasionally produce in their contacts with the American positions, and from the professional assessment that a 56-year-old Bavarian artillery officer, who has been reading operational situations since 1914, can make from the fragmentary information available. What he reads is not encouraging. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, whose initial radio reports produce a brief period of optimism in the Lorient garrison, the specific and documented moment when the garrison's morale rises on the reports of the German advance in Belgium, and when the possibility of a strategic reversal seems, for a few days, to be something more than the professional exercise in optimism that it has been since September, fails to achieve its objectives, and is reversed by January 1945, when the Allied counteroffensive pushes the German forces back to their starting positions. The front is moving east toward Germany, not west toward Brittany. Lorient is not going to be relieved, he holds anyway, not because he does not understand the strategic situation. He understands it with the complete and honest professional assessment of a military commander who has been reading the available intelligence for 9 months and who has the professional experience and the intellectual honesty to read it correctly. He understands that the Ardennes offensive has failed. He understands that the Russian winter offensive has broken the German position in the east. He understands that the Allied advance has reached the Rhine, and that the Rhine crossing, when it comes, will end the German military's capacity for organized resistance. He holds because he is a German general in possession of a Festung order, and because the alternative to holding, surrender, on his own authority, without specific authorization from a Berlin whose communication is intermittent and whose capacity for the rational processing of the surrender question has been declining with every week of the Reich's final dissolution, is a decision of a kind that his professional formation has not prepared him to make unilaterally. He holds because the professional framework of the German officers' training, which extends from the Kaiser's army, through the Reichswehr, through the Wehrmacht, and whose core value is the obedience to orders within the chain of command, whose legitimacy is the foundational premise of the military institution's operational function, and whose violation by individual commanders is the specific threat against which the military's discipline is designed to defend, does not provide a comfortable framework for the unilateral decision to stop fighting when a superior authority has ordered the fighting to continue, does not provide it for Fahrmbacher, whose professional formation has been built in this framework for 37 years of service in 3 different manifestations of the German army, and whose personal identity as a professional soldier is inseparable from the framework's values in ways that make the unilateral surrender decision not simply a professional risk, but a fundamental self-contradiction. The negation of the professional identity that his 37 years of service have been building. And he holds because holding at this stage of the war costs him less than it cost the Allies. Less in casualties because the perimeter fighting has reduced to the occasional patrol contact. Less in operational resources because the static defense consumes less than the offensive the garrison cannot mount. Less in the strategic currency that the war's final phase is spending at rates that the Allied command's resources can absorb and the German commands cannot. May 8, 1945. German surrender. Fahrmbacher transmits his order to the Lorient garrison at 17:15 hours. The war in Europe is over. The garrison will lay down its arms, and the 9-month siege has reached its conclusion, in the only way it was ever going to reach its conclusion. The order is followed with the specific and disciplined compliance of a garrison whose commander has maintained military order through 9 months of siege, without a single documented incident of the kind of breakdown that the conditions would produce in a less professionally managed force. The garrison marches into American captivity, 25,000 German soldiers who have been inside the Lorient pocket since August 1944, who have not fired a shot in anger since the winter of 1944-45, when the perimeter patrols produced their last significant contact, and who have spent 9 months demonstrating that a German garrison can maintain its military organization indefinitely under siege conditions, without attacking or being attacked, simply by virtue of professional military management. The legacy of General Fahrmbacher's 9-month holding of Lorient is a legacy whose assessment requires the honest accounting of what was accomplished and what was not. On the American side of the perimeter, the 94th Infantry Division spent most of its European war at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, watching the pockets whose containment Maloney's formation was assigned to maintain, while the rest of the Allied armies fought their way toward Germany. The division's operational experience of the European campaign is the experience of the containment mission rather than the advance, the experience of an institution assigned to the static rather than the mobile, the defensive rather than the offensive, the watch rather than the advance. Its soldiers' experience of the war they were sent to fight is the experience of perimeter wire and listening posts, and the occasional patrol contact, and the long months of the Breton winter, rather than the mobile combat, whose operational dynamics have been defining the European campaign's character since the Avranches breakout in August 1944. On the German side, the Lorient garrison maintained its organizational coherence through conditions whose difficulty the garrison's post-war accounts consistently describe as the specific and grinding challenge of the indefinite wait. The wait for a relief that was never coming, for orders that were increasingly incoherent, for a strategic situation that was resolved not in Lorient's favor, but in the direction that Fahrmbacher's honest professional assessment had been projecting, since the Ardennes offensive failed in January. The U-boat base that the garrison was holding through this wait, the massive concrete pens of the Lorient submarine facility, the base that the Kriegsmarine had built at such cost, and that the 8th Air Force had tried and failed to destroy through 2 years of bombing, never served the operational function that its holding was supposed to protect. Because the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was being decided in the North Atlantic sea lanes rather than in the Lorient pocket's terrestrial perimeter. The holding of Lorient did not change the Battle of the Atlantic, which was decided in 1943 by the Allied convoy escorts and the Allied air power that made the mid-Atlantic air gap smaller and smaller until the U-boats could no longer operate in it. It did not change the Battle of Germany, which was decided by the Allied armies crossing the Rhine in March 1945 and the Red Army crossing the Oder in the same month. It did not change anything except the specific and local calculation of how many American soldiers were watching a pocket and how many German soldiers were being watched. A calculation whose total, 9 months of containment by a reinforced division and 9 months of garrison by 25,000 soldiers, represents the specific and documented cost of the professional execution of a mission whose strategic purpose had been consumed by the war's broader progress before the mission's first month was complete. What Fahrmbacher's 9-month garrison demonstrates in the specific and honest assessment of what a professional military commander can accomplish through the application of professional competence to a mission whose strategic value his own analysis has established as marginal and whose value declines further with every week that the war's broader outcome moves closer to the conclusion that makes the Lorient garrison's mission irrelevant, is the specific and sobering truth that military professionalism is a value that can be directed toward purposes whose value the professional's assessment has established as marginal or absent. The application of genuine professional competence to the wrong mission does not transform the mission's value, does not make a strategically marginal mission strategically significant by virtue of the professional quality of the commander executing it. It perfects the mission's execution while leaving the mission's purpose unchanged, producing the specific and paradoxical result of an exemplary military operation whose exemplary character is inseparable from its futility. Fahrmbacher was good at holding Lorient, was, by every measurable professional standard that the garrison's post-war records provide, an exemplary garrison commander in an impossible situation, whose management his professional competence made as successful as the situation permitted. He maintained military order through 9 months of conditions whose privations would produce breakdown in a less managed force. He managed the garrison's resources, the food, the ammunition, the medical supplies, the fuel, with the systematic rationing of a commander who understood from August 12 that the siege's duration would be long and that the resources management from the first day was the operational foundation of everything else. He kept the communications open as long as they could be kept open, managed the communications content to maintain the garrison's operational focus, and delivered his garrison into American captivity on May 8th in a state of military organization that his post-war accounts describe with the professional pride of a commander who completed his mission. The mission's strategic value was negligible. Negligible because the U-boats were not coming back to Lorient, because the relief force was not being assembled, because the Allied armies were not going to be stopped by the containment of 25,000 German soldiers in a Breton pocket, when the strategic weight of the Allied campaign was being applied on a front that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. The mission's professional execution was exemplary by every standard that Fahrmbacher's post-war accounts and the garrison's surviving records apply to it. And the gap between those two facts, between the quality of the professional performance and the emptiness of the strategic purpose it served, between the exemplary execution and the negligible result, is the specific and uncomfortable truth that the 9-month siege of Lorient leaves in the historical record. That the most dangerous thing a professional military can produce is a commander who is very good at following orders, whose purpose has already been consumed by the strategic situation that has moved on without him, and who will hold his position with impeccable professional competence long after the position's holding has stopped mattering.